Sabela? Lekai? Rona. So this morning, as we explore the notion, or what I would like to discuss today, is the notion of intergenerational feminisms. In this historical moment of decolonization. And I just want to note that it's quite interesting that particularly for us so-called fallists, we use a language that's very different to the language of transformation. We're quite opposed to using the language of transformation because for us, that word implies add blacks and stir, add women and stir. So ultimately, you're not fundamentally changing how these systems function. You're just, as you highlighted in the last session, you're just saying that those who were previously marginalized can become new oppressors, but you're not actually changing how the systems function. So when we say decolonization, we're saying everything, that's why we say it must fall. It must completely start again in how we think about how we do things. And it's not meaning that, oh, you must, people always say, oh, do you want us to wear beshu because now you want to decolonize? It's not as simplistic as that. It's saying, how do we reimagine ourselves as Africans? And ironically, in some ways, it's similar to what Thabo Mbeki himself was speaking about within the context of an African renaissance, of a new thinking, a new way of doing things as Africans, as opposed to simply saying, can we get more black people at the table? We don't want that table in the first place. We need a new one, right? And so I'm absolutely pleased to be on this panel with Sandile, who is an amazing, radical black feminist. I feel, I don't know if I can say embarrassed sometimes when you're in her presence because of just how great the work that she does. A lot of us, we like the words, but putting the words into action, literally putting bodies on their lines to say that we're going to make sure that these movements are accountable to us as black women. So for example, with Rose Must Fall, what you found, and she will speak to that more, but I really just want to pay tribute to the brilliant work that you've done, saying that with a lot of these movements, we'll write the mission statements, which I'll read. We'll talk about feminism, about the commitment to gender equality, but then, a couple months down the line, all of a sudden we're being erased. We're no longer seen as valuable. And what movements like the Trans Collective, Patriarchy Must Fall have created spaces that run in parallel to say we're going to demand accountability to us as black women. You've used our bodies as labor, you're not going to continue anymore. And every time I see the actions that they do, there's the feminist term of praxis, which is about action and theory, both informing themselves. It's just been really great to be seeing how they put practice and action every single day into creating the space that they want in the name of black love, because black love is uncompromising. It doesn't allow bad standards because, we must understand. No, black love means we hold each other to very high standards, even if it's uncomfortable in the moment. So I just want to thank you for showing us the way, and I'm really humbled to be on a stage with you. So if you can give her a round of applause. That's right. So I want to begin with a Facebook inbox message that I sent to Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi. She's sitting here. After finding out very excitedly on Twitter, and it was a throwaway tweet by someone who said that, that Professor Oyewumi is at the University of South Africa. And I thought, wow, I can't believe that she's here in our presence because I've read of her work, but, and I'll get you to understand why this was so important for me. So here she was in the flesh, less than 100 kilometers away from me in Joburg. And so I sent her an inbox after she'd commented on a post that I made, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is my opportunity. So I said, Dear Professor Oyewumi, and this is word for word what I wrote, so please don't judge how I wrote it. It's my Facebook language. It's not academic language. Such is your impact on my personal and intellectual life that I literally died and went to heaven when I saw your comment on my post about your book. I cannot tell you what the invention of woman did for me. In beginning a journey into understanding womanist and African feminist thought, I frequently saw your name and work cited, and so I set about looking for it. I revived my Amazon account so that I could get the e-version of the book. Once I had it, I regarded the time that I had it with jealousy, feverishly highlighting and bookmarking everything. Woe be to the person who dared disturb me while I read it. Once I had finished it, there was a shift. Like many black people, I'd come into my consciousness of what it was to be an African, to be black, through the consciousness of the heteronormative black male body. I read the Bigos, the Fanons, the Achebes, without considering questions of gender, sexuality, questions of culture. From a literary perspective, what this meant was that I was even dismissive of a book like Nervous Conditions, because it was not the big book on race or colonialism that I'd wanted. The invention of women was a turning point because I began to question. It unsettled things that had been well established in my mind. It was the first time that I truly saw myself as an African woman and not just as an African. When I did my course in debates in feminism and politics at Wits University last year, I was tasked with presenting a seminar on post-colonial feminism. I assigned some of your readings, as well as your writings on your work, to the class, and they thoroughly enjoyed it, as we had a lively discussion and debate prompted by your arguments. I'm glad to say that it now forms part of the course material. I really just wanted to let you know that you're a wonderful force. Your impact continues to be felt far and wide. And of course, I really just wanted to say thank you for your contribution. It really means the world to many of us. Yours, Panashe. So who is this us that I was referring to? It's a generation of young black feminists in and around the university's campuses who form integral parts of the current moment of decolonization. It is within this moment that we've become Janus-faced, which means simultaneously looking back and mining past archives of black and African feminist thought as we begin to forge new intersectional feminist futures. I've since shared with the professor how a friend of mine who was a black first patriarch, and she's a woman, so as you mentioned earlier, women can very easily be instrumentalized in the patriarchal project, and it's nothing unusual. It's actually the exception when you're not an instrument of patriarchy or white supremacy. And she's read the book 3 times in the last month. Someone who was avidly against anything to do with feminism, but this is finally the thing that finally got to her. She said, okay, this is my person, so we thank you for helping us within our circles of black women in academia. Such is the thirst that young black women have at this moment to make intergenerational links with black women who have come before them. In a world that does not value or even discredits black thought, let alone black feminist thought, the knowledge of the existence of African women who have long since been fighting the decolonial fight becomes affirmation, strength, encouragement for the good fight that we're entangled in this current historical moment. This decolonial moment is perhaps best captured in UCT Rosemas Falls mission statement, which begins as follows. We are an independent collective of students, workers, and staff who have come together to end institutionalized racism and patriarchy at UCT. The movement goes on to further clarify their grounding in intersectional feminism, saying, we recognize that experiences of oppression on this campus are intersectional, and we aim to adopt an approach that is cognizant of this going forward. An intersectional approach to our blackness takes into account that we're not only defined by our blackness, but that some of us are also defined by our gender, our sexuality, our able-bodiedness, our mental health, and our class, amongst other things. We all have certain oppressions and certain privileges, and this must inform our organizing so that we do not silence groups among us, and that this means that we do not have to choose between our struggles. Our movement endeavors to make this a reality in our struggle for decolonization. The significance of an anti-racist movement that foregrounds an understanding of various black subjectivities and forges solidarity on this basis cannot be understated. It signals a new political moment for anti-racist praxis as a political consciousness moves away from the narrow recognition of a colonial subjectivity that is once defined by the experiences of black heterosexual males. As Rosema's 4 member Mbali Matandela correctly observes, the exclusion of gendered and other black subjectivities within black anti-racist movements has happened time and again, as revolutionaries have seen sexism as a secondary issue to be dealt with once the revolution has come. Phyllis Ntantala observed the following in her essay titled Womanhood and National Liberation, which appeared in the ANC's publication Sechaba. An unfortunate attitude has taken root in the movement against what people loosely refer to as feminism and sometimes women's lib. More often than not, this attitude shields and is a convenient cover for traditionalist attitudes against the rights of women and masks the fears and inadequacies of men who feel threatened by the loss of power they present or they at present exercise over women. Consequently, many women in these movements towed the party line, and they continue to do so, as is evidenced by this statement by members of the ANC delegation to the Nairobi Conference on Women in 1985 that said, "It would be suicidal for us to adopt feminist ideas. Our enemy is the system, and we cannot exhaust our energies on women's issues." It must be noted that students are not the first to theorize versions of intersectionality within South African anti-racist politics. For example, in 1984, Phyllis Ntantala spoke to the threefold oppression of black women, saying it is high time that we had the courage to grasp the nettle and subject all of these oppressions to criticism. Thus, it is within this moment that you'll find many of us thirsting for an archive of African and black feminist thought. With this new thirst and hunger to consume archives of black feminist thought, young black feminists are often charged with an over-reliance on African American feminist scholars and an under-reliance on African feminist scholars. So it's often your Angela Davis, your bell hooks, we can name the names, I'm sure we can do. And it almost becomes a way that we show off to say, I've read so-and-so. Have you read Audre Lorde? You haven't, have you read so-and-so? So speaking to this in an interview published in Africa magazine, Lisa Thabo, who was meant to be on the panel today, but she unfortunately couldn't make it, who is of the South African Young Feminist Forum, highlights that important lessons can be drawn from black feminists in America, given the similarity of experiences of a white supremacy and patriarchy. However, she says, I think that African American feminists can be mindful of the fact that there is another world of black people outside the US who define blackness and black feminism differently to them. That even though there might be underdogs in the US, that because of how global hierarchies are structured, their ignorance of the rest of us and our struggles can be an oppression in and of itself. Do they know about Marikana in South Africa? Do they know about the woman in Zimbabwe who was attacked for wearing a short skirt? Do they know about the unequal flow of news from the West to the rest of us? Black feminism didn't originate from the States. Black women have been feministing even before white women coined the term. Black women in Africa have been having conversations and living intersectional lives before Kimberly Crenshaw. Beyond this, part of the issue is that there's a problem of erasure of the work of previous generations of who Susan Andrade calls writing and rioting women. That is, predominantly middle-class women who have access to academia, spaces like this, columns, public platforms, 702, whilst the latter, a rioting woman, refers to women who don't necessarily have the same access, but nonetheless protest in public. In her essay published in Vanguard magazine titled From Usobukwe Uti Aiklome to Ungoyi Ati Aiklome, The Face of Politics Cannot Continue to Be a Man, young feminist Simamkele Dlakavu highlights the ways in which this erasure manifests itself in both protest action and the halls of academia, saying, "It was one of those student protests, the kind of protests at our universities that have become a norm again in this country. I don't remember the exact issue of contestation that day, because, there's so many in this white supremacist country of ours. We sang in defiance. uMandela uthi ayihlome, uSibukwe uthi ayihlome, siyaya." As we continue to sing and remember our fallen struggle heroes, Chris Hani, Owa Thabo, Steve Biko, I waited and I waited. I waited for us to continue to sing the names of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Lilian Ngoyi. As she outlines, in this historical moment of decolonization, we still find ourselves falling into the same trap that Africa and other sites of anti-colonial struggles have into, where women's issues have been sidelined and erased. Dakavu further states, I was part of a group of political studies postgrad students at Wits University who contributed to a memo that was sent to our department and university management calling for transformation. Due to pressure from students, 3 new courses were introduced, including one on post-colonialism centered on Frantz Fanon's ideas on decolonization. In a flurry of excitement and pride, I signed up for the course. However, in this new course, there was no engagement with Fanon from a gender lens, and no Black feminist critics were included. Sadly, there was no will to do so. As much as it has been fulfilling reading and reflecting on texts by A.M. Césaire, Frantz Fanon, it has been an exclusionary process for me as a Black woman. In her essay, The Highs and Lows of Black Feminist Criticism, Barbara Christian highlights the erasure of Black women from Black revolutionary literature and thought, as she explained, how at Columbia, her professors bristled at the names of Richard Wright and James Baldwin and barely acknowledged Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison. But what of Black women writers? No phantoms, no bristlings, not even a mention. It is within this context that you can understand my excitement about finding out that Professor Oyewumi was less than 100 kilometers away from me, alive in the flesh. I come from a university that only has 1 Black female professor in the entire academic body. Another challenge that we face is the manner in which the very identification with the term feminism can at times alienate us from our foremothers. This is particularly important for me as an African author who considers herself to be feminist. This year, 2016, marks the 50th anniversary of Flora Nwapa's debut novel, Efuru. This is one of the earliest novels written by an African woman, and certainly the first written by a Nigerian woman. It was the first of many attempts by women across Africa at dismantling the boys' club that was the African literary community. Nwapa is part of a number of prominent women writers whose works have come to define what may be considered important contributions to the African feminist canon, who rejected the label feminist. In an interview with Marie Ume, Nigerian writer Flora Nwapa stated, I don't think I'm a radical feminist. I don't even accept that I'm a feminist. I accept that I'm an ordinary woman who is writing about what she knows. I try to project the image of woman positively. Likewise, the Nigerian writer Buchi Emecheta rejected the term saying, I hate that name. The tag is from the Western world, like we are called the Third World. Both Nwapa and Emecheta paved the way for writers such as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Nedi Okorafor, Bettina Gapa, Tuzugiso Wana, Violet Bulawayo, who now run the world of African literary fiction, both at home and on the global stage. Nwapa was reported to have said that if she's considered the doyen of African female writers, the glory goes to the oral historians, griots, who mesmerized her with stories about the mystical powers of Ogbuede, the mother of the lake, her family members of industrious women, and the men who served as role models, as well as her penchant for service and the pursuit of excellence. While I still find it politically important to self-identify as feminist, the discovery of Nwapa's views of feminism is incredibly liberating for me. It allows me to draw upon the ties of sisterhood with Black women and Black foremothers whose feminism articulates itself differently from mine. It opens a space for collaboration, which might not subscribe to the same terms, but nonetheless all remain dedicated to a radical emancipatory politics. Both Nwapa's feminism by its fruits and refusal to use the label are powerful. After all, if a rose by another name is still a rose, what of feminism? Feminism by another name is still feminism. In the words of the brilliant young poet based in Cape Town, Koleka Putuma, my grandma's feminism doesn't sound like mine. I say patriarchy, she says folk, amadoda. It's all the same thing really, different era. As we negotiate our feminism, we can spend so much time with the labels and defining the best ways to be feminist, while we miss the archives and important touch points that we can draw on. Here is part of a beautiful essay, Mama's Feminism, that appeared on the Crunk Feminist Collective website, that speaks to various feminisms that we can draw on from the communities and histories that we come from. I got my feminism from my mama, even though she doesn't know it, and my grandmother and my aunts. They had a feminism that would fight back and hide behind the masks of smiles or scorn. My mama's feminism was wrapped up in God and respectability politics she could never live up to. My grandmama's feminism was housed in her meanness and caution. She carried it with her for emergencies and for protection, like the cigarettes in her pocket and the gun in her bra. My aunts held their feminism in their laughter and occasional anger. They used it to cover up their pain. They didn't know they were feminists. They didn't mean to pass it on to me, but they couldn't help it. My mama's feminism is inherited but unnamed. She taught me how to own my feminism like I own myself. She taught me how to be a feminist by being herself. Of course, even if we are to recognize the continuities, this will not automatically smooth or fill the gulfs that can sometimes emerge between feminists of different generations. This is an area that I can find, or that I find to be the most challenging for the current moment of decolonization. A few weeks back, I had written on the subject of the seeming intergenerational divide between Black people in this current moment. I'd noted that we have not yet understood or modeled intergenerational dialogue. Discussions quickly become polarizing, and each side or generation loses important perspectives and insights from each other. Here I highlighted a trend of how older Black people, particularly those who form the political and intellectual class, blackmail young Black people by positioning themselves as wise parents to misbehaving kids. This is such that many young Black people have learned that when a statement begins with, "when we were," or "in 1976, we are not going to be presented with a genuine opportunity for engagement and learning, but instead, it's an opportunity for our youthful perspectives to be delegitimized and dismissed. Not a week since the ink had dried on that article, we were fortunate to be the listeners to an infamous conversation on 702 that gave us an example of how these intergenerational conversations can quickly break down. It was on the occasion of a scheduled 36-minute-long interview between Nomboniso Gasa, who was the host, and Wanelisa Thabo, who was to speak about the Rose Must Fall movement. Due to a breakdown caused by an aggressive and hostile general posture and particularly invective interventions by Gasa, the interview deteriorated, lasting only half of the interview time, about 16 minutes. Incidentally, Thabo had greeted Gasa with, "Hi, Mama," and acknowledging Gasa as a senior, deserving of the respect our culture makes available between young and old. And yet, this was abused. This interaction had me referring to Audre Lorde's essay, Scratching the Surface, Some Notes on Barriers to Women and Loving, which delves into disagreements amongst Black women. The distortion of relationship which says, "I disagree with you, so I must destroy you," leaves us as Black people with basically uncreative victories defeated in any common struggle. This jugular vein psychology is based on the fallacy that your assertion or affirmation of self is an attack on myself, or retards your self-definition. The supposition that one sex needs the other's acquiescence in order to exist prevents both from moving together as self-defined persons towards one goal. I've become increasingly interested in the value of respectful disagreement in the kind of world we want to live in, and establishing that there are many ways around which we agree and many ways in which we are similar. That in some ways, the basis for our disagreements is founded on some solid ground and critical differences. My interest in respectful disagreement amongst Black people, and particularly amongst Black feminists, is not due to a love of respectability politics, but rather for recognition of the fact that every time we fail to model Black love, even in disagreement, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy wins the day, as it did that day with Me Nomboniso and Sis Swanelisa. To borrow words from Sisonke Msmang, because we aren't just saints who are so wonderful and evolved, we must choose respect as a political strategy. If we understand there will not be a single event that brings us about nirvana, then respectful disagreement must be seen as a guiding principle for us. Thus, I want to end off my presentation with a question that will hopefully begin a new conversation on intergenerational organizing and dialoguing amongst Black feminists. How and when and why do we agree and disagree publicly and privately? Are we at a space collectively as Black women trying to change the world where we can afford this and what happens when we don't agree? Thank you.